new friends, and this is a very tough topic. You know, when I spoke, someone is going to come and help me fix this. But in the meantime, I will try my best to project my voice as best as possible. And some people reminded me last time that I shouldn't speak so quickly, so I hope this is a better pace. Hold on one second. Mark's going to help me get the volume on this naturally better. Okay. So, last week we talked about Israel-diaspora relations, and we related it to the parshas, the chapters in the Torah, the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. And that really being the first diaspora, the first dispersion from the Greek word dispersos. And did everybody read last week's Torah portion, Shemot, the beginning of the book of Exodus? And this week, Vayera? What happens? Who wants to volunteer? The Jews are slaves. The Israelites are slaves in Egypt. What happens to them? Anybody want to tell me what their experience is in Egypt? How do they feel?
Lousy.
They were happy.
Lousy, unhappy.
Yeah. They were satisfied.
Beaten down.
They were beaten down. They were certainly second-class citizens. They were fourth-class citizens. They weren't citizens. The concept of nation-states didn't exist yet, but they were killed. I mean, you know, the Pharaoh decreed that every Jewish male should be thrown into the Nile. Moses was famously saved because his mother put her in a basket. What else do we know? We know that they were oppressed. We know that they were forced to, you know, use straw to make the material for the pyramids, and then the straw was taken away, and that task became worse, and many were beaten and killed. It was a horrible period, but it happened a long time ago. And yet, every Passover, when we read the Haggadah, when we read the story, which is really what we're covering now. Right now, when you're reading these next 2-3 chapters in the book of Exodus, this really is the Haggadah story that we all read for the first 2 nights of Passover. We are commanded to feel as though each of us left Egypt. Ki'ilu shehu yatsa mitzrayim. So for millennia, one of the hallmarks of Jewish identity has been to feel like we were along with all the other Israelites who were taken out of Egypt, and that is our legacy, that is our patrimony. We have the celebration of Passover, and even when we say our Sabbath prayers, and we recognize the glory of God, we recognize that He is the creator of the universe and the one who redeemed us from Egypt. Those are the big ones. But we don't, second-class citizens, fourth-class citizens, suffered, lousy. These are words that are somewhat generic. When we talk about the Holocaust, words escape us. And it's not something that happened a long time ago. It's something that some people here in the audience may remember. Every one of us knows a Holocaust survivor. Dr. Alan Feingold and his daughter Jessica are here, and his in-laws were Holocaust survivors, and they're long-standing members of the synagogue. And later on, I'm going to welcome him and Jessica, if she likes to share sort of their experience as a second-generation, third-generation Holocaust survivor. My parents were both born in Europe during the Holocaust, and everybody in this room has a story related directly or indirectly to the Holocaust. Let me tell you mine. My mother was born right near the Vilna ghetto, and she was in the ghetto in her infancy. Her father was murdered by the Nazis. She never knew her father. Her mother was a 19-year-old widow. Miraculously, my mother's life was saved by a righteous Gentile that took her into her home, and my mom actually grew up in Stalin and Malenkov, Soviet Union, and left in the 1960s. My father is also a Holocaust survivor. He was born in Czechoslovakia, in the Tatra Mountains, it's now Slovakia. He and his parents, he's an only child, he and his parents and grandparents and uncle, the 6 of them were the only people who survived from their town. They were hidden with the partisans in sort of the Austro-Hungarian border, and survived, went back to Czechoslovakia, were chased out by the communists. My father emigrated to Canada in the early 50s, grew up in Montreal. There are a lot of Canadians here in the room. I see someone even has the Canadien kippa. But the experience of growing up in Canada, and the immigration wave in Canada generally came later. So I grew up in a sea of different accents. Hungarian accents, Dr. Feingold can relate to this as well, from the same shtetl. But the compendium of accents was very foreign to me. My mom still speaks with a very thick Russian accent. My father, I thought, spoke more native English, so I related better to that. I didn't want to be a greenhorn. I was actually born in Israel as a Canadian citizen on the 4th of July. My parents met at an ulpan, at a Hebrew language institute in Netanya, Ulpan Akiva. My mom spoke Russian, some Lithuanian and Polish. My dad spoke French, English, German. They didn't share a common language, which is lucky for me, or else I wouldn't exist. But that one, yes. But they've been married for 50 years, so we can celebrate that happily. The issue is that was something I knew, right? But I'm talking to you now about the 1960s, early 70s. People didn't discuss the Holocaust. It just wasn't talked about, especially among people who survived it. But there was I went to a parochial day school, Talmud Torah in Montreal, and they made a decision they were going to show Holocaust movies on Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I remember being 6 years old, and I was absolutely traumatized. I saw, and they were graphic. They don't show these films anymore to kids, and even I don't remember, even Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, they don't show things this graphic. Pitchforks being used, bulldozers being used to scoop up the cadavers, throw them in these giant pits. And I was sentient enough as a 6-year-old to know that I have no business watching these things. And the next year, when I was in the 2nd grade, I actually created a disturbance so I'd get kicked out. I'd rather have, a week of detention than a month of nightmares. That was not a Jewish identity that I wanted to relate to at all. This is the lemming mentality, sheep being led to the slaughter. It was the way Holocaust was thought about for the first 20, 30 years after the Holocaust took place. It was a very, very different brand of Jewish identity. And I felt like, where was Superman? Where was Batman? Where was anybody to save these poor, helpless souls? And I would see little kids in these movies, the famous one with the little boy being arrested, and I thought he looked a bit like me. And, it's hard to be a Holocaust survivor born in the 1960s, and that's why there's a little bit of that identity in every one of us around the room. Both my parents are professors at McGill, so they took a sabbatical, and when I was in the 3rd grade, and this is 1972, suddenly this is a brand new Jewish identity. This is after the 6-Day War and before the Yom Kippur War. And you are seeing Superman, Batman. We don't need those superheroes because we have fighter pilots and paratroopers and commandos. This is the new Israel. This is the new Jewish paradigm. This is what I wanted to relate to. And I felt that I'll sign up for this. This makes me proud. These aren't sheep being slaughtered. These are people who are attacked, defend themselves, and get more, right? We didn't start the war in 48. They started it. We won it, and we got more. We didn't start the war in 67. That's the narrative. They started it. We won it, and we got more. Don't start up with us, because we'll get more. And there was no Holocaust. They didn't show movies in my third grade class in Jerusalem. There was an awareness of the Holocaust, and the week before the Israeli Remembrance Day, Yom HaZikaron, you do have Yom HaShoah, and you do stand up, and it's called Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura. It's not just the Shoah, it's also the heroism, because that's the only way to be able to cope with the juxtaposition of the tragedy of the Shoah, which means the calamity, the catastrophe. Certainly religious Jews didn't like the word Holocaust. Again, we talked about diaspora coming from the Greek word dispersos. Holocaust is a combination of holos kostos, which means everything is consumed by fire, which was sort of a Greek pagan ritual. It's a very appropriate word if you think about what Jewry was before the Holocaust and what happened to it afterwards. But to me, this was a life-changing experience. And I remember on Passover, we went to, my mom was friendly with a commander in a Gaza camp, and then we were going to spend the Seder there and then spend the week in the Sinai. And I met a soldier, and it was funny because he was probably 20 years old and I was 8, and I knew the Haggadah better than he did because he obviously came from a secular home. They read it quickly, and they only do one, right? We do two. So I had the benefit of reinforcement, but we became friends. We made a deal. He knew he wanted to finish the army service, and he was going to write to me in English to practice his English, and I was before email, obviously, and other modern means of correspondence, and I was going to write to him in Hebrew, and we'd be pen pals. During the week that we were traveling through the Sinai, I made another friend, the Chovesh, the army medic who was leading our trip, and he and I made the same deal. So I'm like now becoming a little 8-year-old writer, corresponding with soldiers. The reason I'm sharing this story is because we went back to Montreal in August, and in October my mom told me that both my pen pals fell at the Bar-Lev line in the Yom Kippur War. So, you know, the Holocaust ended, but the battle and the challenges persist. And the juxtaposition of Israel and the legacy that got us here, and this goes back to yesterday's class, never leaves us and never should. But what does it mean to be, you know, Jewish with that as the background? And if you go to the second half of the 20th century, in polls taken here at the end of, and I think that's changed. If they took a poll today, I bet it would be different. I haven't seen updated statistics. But when you looked at how American Jews, what was sort of some of their defining contributions to their Jewish identity, you know, synagogue participation was on that list, and trips to Israel were on that list. But the Holocaust was number one by far in a poll taken 15, 16 years ago. That was a unifying element among American Jews. In Israel, it was a little more difficult, especially when you analyze the helplessness felt in the Yishuv, the helplessness felt in Eretz Yisrael before the creation of the modern state. They had their own battles to fight against the British and against the Arabs, a political battle and an existential battle, and they wanted to contribute. I mean, they wanted to, you know, volunteer and have a Jewish legion as far as within the British forces, which was rejected, and then Jews fought alongside regular units. In Canada and the United States, Jews joined the military forces in massive disproportionate numbers relative to their population, and also were lost in battle. The United States and Canada and Britain and Australia and South Africa contributed an enormous amount of human resource to that battle. But in Israel, this idea of gvura, I mean, the goal in Israel was to, you know, have lochamei getaot, or Yad Mordechai, the people who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto. And anybody who tells you that there was no acts of heroism during the Holocaust, just share with them this one anecdote, that the Jewish fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto resisted the Germans with their little pipes and makeshift weapons and lasted longer than the whole country of France. All right, so that's, you know, put that on your radar screen in case someone comes and says, you know, there was no resistance. Just surviving in and of itself required resistance. And we are blessed in this congregation to have a meaningful number of Holocaust survivors. Statistically speaking, along with demographics everywhere else in the world, that number is going to get smaller and smaller every year. And, you know, growing up, and I'm not a baby anymore, but growing up, to me, Holocaust survivors were old people. And now they're older people. You know, there are no young Holocaust survivors. But in order to survive the Holocaust, also statistically speaking, you had to be young. If you were old in the 1940s, you were not going to survive. If you're a nonagenarian, if you're 90 years old today, you were 20 when the war ended and 14 when the war started. And though that's, you know, that's sort of the demographic that was much more likely to survive, more nimble, more creative, and then their lives kind of get crystallized in their teens and 20s, in many cases 30s, And it's those indelible memories, nightmares, traumas that carried them through a period of time, first of all, when it wasn't discussed, and then when it became the defining issue in Jewish identity. I remember being asked, whether or not I wanted to lead a trip of March to the Living. Who here's been on March to the Living? Okay.
I was on the very first one in '88.
There you go. So it's been, okay, so who here has visited the concentration camps in a trip, not March to the Living? Okay, so a more meaningful number, but still a minority in the room. And I'm not surprised by that. I didn't want to go. I really didn't want to go. And I told a friend of mine who was organizing this, I said, I'm not interested in doing this. And he said, Lyon, come on, it'll be good. We want to get one bus from New York, and I think it's important that the young leadership, young professionals, it was exactly 10 years ago, 2005, to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. So I went to this little cocktail reception, and most people were my age and a little bit younger, so we're looking late 20s, early 30s, and I was stupefied. I talked to people, and their Holocaust literacy was abominable. They didn't know. I mean, they knew it happened, but they didn't know exactly what, when. Number 6 million obviously resonated. But in terms of the details, in terms of the history, I felt it was really important to do that, and then I tried to recruit some other people to do it. We wound up having 3 buses. It was a very significant, meaningful experience for me, and I certainly understand why I resisted going, but I'm glad that trip took place, and I'd encourage other people to be open-minded, because there's no substitute for actually seeing face-to-face what happened. And it's now it's a museum, but it's a museum we went with Holocaust survivors. Subsequent generations won't have that luxury, won't have that privilege, but it was a very, very powerful experience. I went early though, and I had 2 experiences that kind of shocked me. I went to Warsaw first just to make sure things would be okay for the trip, and 2 people walked up to me in Hebrew and said, what are you doing here? I'm here at March to the Living. What are you doing here? We're building Warsaw. We're building shopping centers. Remember, this is the Eastern European real estate boom of 10, 12 years ago, and it was shocking to me that the Israelis, I didn't know how to feel about that. I mean, they're rebuilding Warsaw, which is a pretty nice city with a pretty nice river. So you go to the ghetto and you realize that 10% of the population of the city lived in 1.5% of the land, and that they were complicit in making this happen. You sort of look at the polls in a different way, except, and maybe we should talk a little bit about who did what to whom. The Poles were not, they were complicit like many of the other populations, but they weren't the worst. They were certainly not Tzaddikim. But Poland was a convenient place to build the concentration camps for logistical reasons. But the guards in the concentration camps were for the most part Ukrainians and Lithuanians. The Germans knew who to recruit. And when the Einsatzgruppen were rounding up Jews in 1942, when the